going to jump in and kick things off. This is the... Oh, there we go. Thank you, on cue. So this is the second in the series where we're going to be discussing Leo Panitch and Colin Lay's new book, Searching for Socialism, the project of the Labour New Left from Ben to Corbyn. We're going to be joined by some really exciting guests for the whole of the series. Last week we were joined, 2 weeks ago we were joined by Tariq Ali, where we discussed the experience of the Labour Party and the British left in the post-war years. And this week we're going to be joined by Hilary Wainwright to talk about the experience of the New Left and Tony Benn in the Labour Party around the 1970s. My name is Kyla.
And my name is Mihal. And tonight, Leo and Hilary and all of you are joining us in our wonderful living room. We will be hosting the call tonight and for the remainder of the series, and we hope you're doing okay. This series is hosted by The World Transformed and Verso Books together. We'll be running these calls every other Thursday night at 8 p.m., same virtual place, same time. So remember to keep this time free and tune in.
Okay, so Verso have created a reading list tailored to this series. It's 50% off till May the 24th, which is in
2 days.
I don't know anymore.
Fast. You have to act fast.
So to make sure to order in time for the rest of the course, you can find it at bit.ly/TWT Verso. That's going to be posted in the chat. So each webinar comes with this a set of short and long optional readings, as well as videos and podcasts, which you can find on the TWT website or the Facebook event. So this week is mostly going to be based on chapters 1 to 4 of Searching for Socialism. We currently have more than 230 people on the live chat, which is already amazing. Thanks for joining us.
So in this session, we're going to be talking about the experiences of the New Left and their project to transform the Labour Party in the 1970s and 80s, which in many ways was a precursor to Jeremy Corbyn's election in 2015, even if they were slightly different, probably very different projects. But one thing that's incredible in reading Colin and Leo's book, which we've been doing, chapters 1 to 4 were the readings for this week, is that all of the challenges of the movement behind Corbyn are really not that new. So many of the problems that we've been coming to grips with are the same as the ones that the New Left faced in the 1970s. So we know Leo and Hilary were both heavily involved in those projects and the debates back then. So it's going to be fantastic to hear the lessons that we can draw on. One lesson that Tony Benn drew from his experience of the time, which still feels just as relevant now, was that the long campaign to democratize power in Britain had to begin with the movement itself, with democratizing the movement itself. So tonight we'll look at how Benn and the New Left envisaged a new politics and what came of their attempts to democratize the party.
In later sessions, we're going to be looking at the turn to the right in the party from the 1980s, which is based on chapters 5 to 8 of Leo and Colin's new book. And then we're going to be looking at international experiences, comparing experiences of the movement around Corbyn with Sanders and Syriza. And then we're going to be looking at coronavirus and the crisis this time. We're going to run tonight's webinar as a long question and answer session. So we're going to talk through some parts of the book with Leo and Hilary by asking some questions to start off. After that, we hope that you'll do the work for us. When questions come for you as Leo and Hilary are speaking, please post them in the chat. We'll be watching the questions as they arrive, and we will try our best to include them in the discussion. We plan to spend the first 45 minutes or so on the New Left in the 1970s, and then the remainder of the time bringing things up to date by looking at the relevance of these issues today and to our own political project.
So finally, before we begin, I want to quickly introduce tonight's speakers. Leo Panitch is back again with us. He is Canada Research Chair in Comparative Political Economy and Distinguished Research Professor of Political Science at York University. He's been the editor of the Socialist Register for 25 years, and his many books include A Different Kind of State, The End of Parliamentary Socialism with Colin Lays, and The Making of Global Capitalism with Sam Gindin, and of course, Searching for Socialism, also with Colin Lays. And also joining us tonight, we're very happy to have Hilary Wainwright. She's the editor of Red Pepper, the author of countless books on the left and the Labour Party in Britain, including her most recent book, A New Politics from the Left, and she has been a real inspiration to all of us here at The World Transformed.
Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to kick off this session with a question for both of you, Hilary and Leo. So in the last session, we looked a lot at how in the post-war era, the emerging Cold War served to marginalize and demonize the left, but there were also political and financial pressures that closed in on the government and dampened the hopes raised by the post-war Labour Party in the 1950s. Hilary and Leo, one thing I loved in reading about both your books is how all this started to change with the new forms of activism that sprung up in the 1960s. So there's kind of new forms of unionism, as well as like these kind of new social movements, and how these new forms of activism eventually burst into mainstream politics and really tried to shake it up. Hilary, there's a great quote from you taken from E.P. Thompson about it from a 19th century artisan, where you say, where he says, people fancy that when all's quiet, all's stagnating. Propaganda is going on for all that. It's when all's quiet that the seeds are growing. So tell us about these seeds that were growing. Who were these movements? Where did they come from? And what were the issues that were most important to them? And what was their vision? Leo, should we start with you?
Hilary's quote, I thought you'd start with her, but sure, let's talk about this. By the early 1960s, the first really massive social movement, even before the American Civil Rights Movement had emerged, which was the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. And that was built very much with the active involvement of the old labor left, the Tribunite left, if you like, the Bevanite left. And the major splits in the party between the leadership and the left focused around the Labor Party's embrace of the American informal empire and all that went with it in terms of the Cold War and the nuclear arms race. There was a fight in the 1950s around already then about whether to get rid of Clause 4, the commitment to common ownership, because most of the party leadership had by then accepted Anthony Crosland's view of what had happened to capitalism by the 1950s. I think I've said before that Crosland's The Future of Socialism said that if you weren't a Marxist in the 30s, you were a mental dwarf. That was his word. I hope disability activists will forgive me. But by the 1950s, that was no longer relevant because the capitalist class no longer controlled the state, because there was a balance of power between labor and capital, and because within the capitalist class, finance was no longer a power. Now you see how absurd that was, even for the 1950s. But it was in that context that the German Social Democratic Party dropped its commitment to socialism, and the Gaitskelites wanted to move in that direction. What exploded in the 1960s was both a follow-up to the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, but took it in entirely new directions. Movements which were oriented to anti-war concerns, of course, the enormous anti-Vietnam demonstrations and campaigns, which some of the largest in the world were in Britain. But alongside that, movements for women's liberation and gay liberation. And on top of all of that, a tremendous outpouring of militancy on the part of young workers who are often going on unofficial strikes against their union leaders. And that wasn't only a matter of, yes, wanting to be able to consume more, and certainly they were wanting to do that subject to all the consumerist propaganda by the 1960s, but it was also about resisting changes in the labor process, which were draconian and often authoritarian. And under conditions of full employment, young workers, as well as the young activists who built these new movements, were quite insubordinate. And the labor leadership, including the old left, were largely estranged from those new movements. They weren't part of them. They might have, in a vague sense, endorsed their goals, but it was a different political culture, both amongst the young workers and amongst the young activists. They all voted for labor in 1964. There was a vast vote for labor amongst young workers who first came on the polls in the 1964 election. But by 1970, after the very conventional government that the Wilson government was, those young workers started abstaining from voting in droves, and young activists considered going into the Labour Party the last thing they wanted to do. I think that's the kind of background that is needed to appreciate what happened in the 1970s.
Hilary, I think you're going to have to unmute yourself. Sorry, I can't.
I thought I had.
There we are.
Okay,
Thank
yeah.
you.
So I agree in general with Leo. I would emphasize a bit more the sense in which 68 and that experience of kind of what felt at the time like a near revolution, was a really significant experience that shaped the consciousness of a generation for, well, I feel until now, in a way. I mean, it's sort of lasting, that glimpse of a possibility, the fact that there was an alternative and that the ruling elites were weak. In a way, in France, without going into the detail, it felt at the time, and I was at university then, but it really did feel like a revolution was possible if it hadn't been for the constraining role of the Communist Party and so on. Maybe not true, but it felt that glimpse of a possibility gave us a huge confidence that we carried through to the 70s. And I think I'd also emphasize something Leo said, which is this idea that this was all it was against the Labour Party. So at this time, Harold Wilson was he was about to support the LBJ and the Vietnam War. It was only the massive weight of that demonstration and its impact on the Labour left that then turned them to vote against Wilson. So and Wilson was attacking militant trade unionists. He was he was defending Sterling and the British state. So he was a reactionary figure, and we treated the Labour Party as utterly reactionary too. Okay, there were benign figures at that time like Michael Foot, but they were like rather pathetic. Well, I mean, I don't want to imply Michael Foot was pathetic, but in some ways politically he was, and he might have been a literary figure, but politically, he was pathetic. And so that is almost like our launching pad into the 70s. I mean, the seeds that Thompson refers to were more the pre-68 seeds, like the beginnings of the women's movement, the way we were all reading Simone de Beauvoir, the sort of beatniks, the kind of, I mean, this was, I think the other thing is this was a rejection of the Cold War, but with the Cold War, the whole kind of conventional, the conventions of 1950s Britain. It was a time of everyday revolt, cultural revolt in the films and so on, but also just a revolt against authority. I mean, that movement, particularly in Germany, was called anti-authoritarian. And we were against authority. That's when you saw, in a way, the beginnings of a search for new kinds of democracy, participatory democracy, more horizontal, radical forms of democracy, a greater belief in the knowledge of ordinary people. That was key in the women's movement, but also in the shop stewards movement. So it was a fundamental break. And for me, that influenced the 70s in the sense that, I mean, I think one's got to look quite specifically in different regions when we come on to discuss the movements in the 70s, because I must say, where I was coming from, I was in Tyneside, which was a very Labour place, but actually all the struggles were outside the Labour Party, including the industrial struggles that would relate to Ben, but from a position of autonomy. That was the other thing, that the 68 movements have this emphasis on autonomy, the autonomy of the student movement from the authorities who wanted to negotiate with us, the autonomy of the women's movement from other parts of the left. Autonomy wasn't the same as separation, but it meant that we kind of preserved our autonomy, and that meant that that shaped the way in which those who did go into the Labour Party went into the Labour Party. They went in on the basis of their movements, and this, we're going to talk later about the GLC, but there you had councillors who obviously were in the Labour Party, but their key feature was that they'd been involved in movements, community movements, and that in a way their electoral politics was like an expression of that extra parliamentary politics. So that's just to add a bit to what Leo said.
Perfect. Thank you for that. That's actually perfect. I like how that, how you worked in your answers, that sort of broad range of movements and moving all the way from the 50s up to 68. Speaking of the spirit of 1968, the reaction to consumption and advertising, before we get to the next question, we want to take this opportunity to plug the TWT Supporters Network. We know many people are in tough financial situations, especially right now, and we will always ensure that content like this call is available free of charge to everyone. However, if you think calls like this are important in this time of global crisis and uncertainty, and if you are also financially secure, please do consider supporting TWT. Every bit helps us. The coronavirus crisis poses an existential threat to independent grassroots organizations like us. So if you're able to donate £5 a month, it would make a huge difference in enabling us to scale up and sustain our political education work like this series. You can sign up at theworldtransformed.org/support, and that link will appear in the chat. Thanks so much. Sorry for this advertising break, and we are back to our questions.
All right, so the next question is mostly for Leo, and then we're going to ask Hilary a slightly related but different question about the same topic. So one thing I really like about your book is that you do a really good job of debunking this myth that was said against Tony Benn, and we've had this thrown at us a lot as well, is that the left was looking to the past and failed to come to grips with the new era of globalization. One thing I really liked about your book was that you describe how the Labour New Left was conceived as a response to the post-war social democratic corporatist social contract and the problems with that, and the growing mobility of capital. And these are precisely the types of arguments that Ben was trying to make when he proposed his alternative strategy. So can you describe the battle over the industrial strategy during Ben's time as Minister for Industry, and how it was constantly watered down by parliamentary leadership, and what are the lessons that we can learn in terms of kind of trying to build this kind of agenda?
Okay, well, first of all, it has to be said, Ben was, of course, a member of the Wilson government. But by the late 1960s, he was already making speeches primarily oriented around how his experience in government made him realize how fundamentally undemocratic the British state was. And how it stifled any creativity, even of radically oriented ministers. And right after the election defeat in 1970, 3 months after, he published a Fabian pamphlet, which he called A Socialist Reconnaissance, in which he identified the main thing that was needed was for the Labour Party to get in tune with these young movement activists. If the British state was going to be democratized, then you first of all had to democratize the Labour Party in order to democratize the British state. And that pamphlet, while it was oriented to going beyond the Keynesian policies that the Labour leadership had ended up with as the sum total of what they defined as modernization by the 1960s. It was mainly oriented to opening up to the new campaign groups, opening up the party to democratic constitutional changes, which could then go on to democratize the state. At the same time, however, there was a lot of pressure to go beyond the policy framework. And Ben, within a year, said, I gave too short a shrift to the need to concentrate on policy. And that was articulated in two ways. One was that what had happened under that Labor government was essentially a class struggle inside the labor movement between a government which was arguing that we can only hold on to Keynesian policies insofar as the unions restrain their members' wage demands, restrain their members' limitations on the introduction of labor process and technology changes, which would increase productivity. And there were major battles between the government and the unions over this, with sections of the union leadership, especially the transport and general workers, but not only, moving to the left in the face of that government. The leader of the transport and general workers had become a member of the government, the Minister of Industry, and left the government by 1966 after the government entered into a deal with the IMF, saying that he actually knew more about the plans of corporations when he was General Secretary of the Union than he did as the minister responsible for technology. And you got an array of union leaders who had been close to Communist Party shop stewards in their youth through the 1940s and 1950s, people like Jack Jones, who were much more oriented to going beyond the Keynesian policies, to bringing up again, not only common ownership of industry, but industrial democracy within newly nationalized sectors, and also positively oriented to taking the financial sector into the public domain, taking the City of London into the public domain. And lo and behold, at the 1971 Party Conference, against the advice of the National Executive Committee, a resolution moved by a woman who is not much remembered, but should be revered by the labor left today, Jo Richardson. She moved a resolution calling for the nationalization of Britain's banks. And lo and behold, it was passed, with the unions as well as the vast majority of members, the left unions, voting for it. And it was passed with a large enough majority that it should have gone into the party platform constitutionally. This kicked off a shift to the left in policy in the period in opposition between 1970 and the re-election of the Labor government 4 years later. And there was a battle royal inside the party headquarters over this. Policy at that time was made by a range of policy committees, not this policy forum that was shunted off to the side. And it was split between the left and the right. The Home Policy Committee was responsible for developing policy that would go into a manifesto. The finance and economic policy subsection of it was controlled by the labor right, and it was desperately concerned to prevent that resolution going forward. And it managed to hive it off. The Industrial Policy Subcommittee, which was headed up by Ben and Eric Heffer, brought in a series of brilliant young intellectuals, Stuart Holland, the leading amongst them, to try to think through what a more radical strategy than Keynesianism plus wage restraint, wage repression might lead to. And they developed what was the industrial policy of the Labor Party in that period. And if you look at the 2017 party program, it in many respects is not as radical as was evolved at that time. And some 80 subcommittees were at work, working on this. And essentially what this amounted to was a recognition that Britain's economic difficulties did relate to its loss of manufacturing competitiveness in an increasingly globalized world, and that if you were going to be able to operate a socially just society within that world, you needed not only much more radical policies of redistribution, a wealth tax, etc., not only a degree of control over the financial institutions, but you needed to recognize that simply throwing money at corporations to try to get them to invest more in manufacturing in Britain would not do it, insofar as they were convinced there was not sufficient demand. And therefore, they argued that it was necessary to take a certain number of manufacturing firms directly into the public sector and to supplement that with at least the public ownership of one major bank and a number of insurance companies, so you could draw on the increasing institutional funds that insurance companies held. And in that way, supplement a system of what they called planning agreements, whereby other corporations would have to sign a binding agreement with the Labor government to invest a certain amount in certain places, in certain ways, etc. And that essentially was the program that was evolved in 1972 and 73 that produced the very radical labor program of 1973, and a resolution put to the Labor Party conference that year calling for the nationalization of 25 companies. This drove the Wilson leadership to distraction. And he immediately said, we will not abide by this, when it was passed at party conference. This then connected with the demands for greater democratization of the party that Ben had articulated in that 1970 pamphlet. And what was formed that year was a campaign for Labor Party democracy, which articulated the need for the reselection of MPs, the need for the leader to be elected by the wider party, not just by the career politicians in the Parliamentary Labor Party. That is, the whole thrust of the attempt to change the Labor Party was established by this combination of a shift to the left in policy terms towards more explicitly socialist goals, together with a recognition that to democratize the state to implement any of these, you'd have to democratize the party.
So before, Hilary, I want you in on this too, but I have a question from the chat that I think follows up really nicely on this. And I'll give maybe Hilary first crack at it. It comes from Max Shanley, and he says, as the 60s progressed, it became clear to Ben, almost uniquely inside the Labour cabinet, that there were limits to Labour's framework of reform, and that for the post-war reforms to be maintained, there was need to go beyond them. So sort of the things that Leo, you just talked about. I was hoping that both of you could talk a bit more about that problem of operationalizing that politically. So Max goes on here at Conference 79, Ben, the problem was basically how to transition beyond capitalism whilst being forced to run the system in the first place. So at Conference 79, Ben described this issue as, quote unquote, the usual problem of the reformer. So could the two of you please talk a bit more about that problem, the questions it raises for the Labour left today as well? Maybe we'll get to that later. Just the questions it raised for the Labour Party at the time, and what ideas you have to not get trapped by this sort of usual problem that affects all socialist reformers. And I'll maybe tag on a tiny bit of a question I had as well reading the book, was this sort of tension between the sort of bureaucratic wrangling, within the party about process that Leo kind of finished on as well, which isn't super exciting, and that that's not the thing that most people get into politics for, but turned out to be necessary for actually getting your politics done. So sort of this usual problem of reformers and that tension between sort of bureaucratic inside the party things and sort of politics writ large.
Yeah, do you want me to start? Okay, so I'll approach that maybe traditionally one would approach it in terms of the state. But I think before getting on to the state, I want to talk about the working class, i.e. the agency of revolutionary change or of transformation. And I think this is where Ben was at his most radical. In a way, it combined with his critique and frustration with the the nature of the British state. But I think that one of the key things which makes him different, in my opinion, from the Tribunite left, is that he was radicalized, in fact, by the working class, by the experience, which is often talked about when he went to the Upper Clyde shipbuilders. The story's in Leo's book, so I won't repeat it in detail. But basically, he came out of that with a sort of real belief in the capacity and energy of the working class, and that was particularly in manufacturing. In a way, it led him to what you could, since we've been talking about modernization, an alternative view of modernization. That he believed that the people who really had a belief in changing British industry were not the rather decadent, sort of complacent management of the companies that they'd allowed to basically become sort of uncompetitive. But actually, the working class and activists, engineers, designers, and so on that he met on the Upper Clyde shipbuilding, and that stayed with him. So that actually the committee that Leo refers to, in which people like Stuart Holland and other really good economists were involved. I think Francis Cripps. Anyway, but also there were some shop stewards. I mean, I remember I was working at that time with shop stewards from Vickers Engineering on Tyneside. I later worked with shop stewards in Lucas Aerospace, and the main convener at Vickers, a guy called Jimmy Murray, he was on this committee, with Stuart Holland and so on. And actually that meant that this idea of planning agreements, which I agree with Leo's description of it, but the condition was not only an agreement with the Labour government, but an agreement with the workers. So actually the idea of industrial democracy was built into the process of planning agreements. So, it was actually bringing workers' representatives into the process of industrial planning and economic planning. And in a way that was kind of fundamental. Later on, I think we're going to talk about Lucas Aerospace, but that was in a context which is very different from now, where shop stewards committees really were incredibly powerful. I mean, in a way, in many factories, whether it's the car industry like Ford's, or so brilliantly described by Hugh Bainan in Working for Ford, or in engineering companies like Vickers and so on, they were so confident, and it was reflected in the kind of the campaigning that Ben did around the country. I mean, in Tyneside, these shop stewards got together, and in the shipyards, they produced their own plan, and it was headed workers' control with management participation. And that was quite, particular, but it was an expression of that sort of self-confidence. And in a way, that then led, in ways we'll perhaps discuss, to a kind of conflict with the secrecy, the bureaucracy, and the sort of parliamentarism of the British state. I mean, I've got it here, but when Tony Benn was in the Department of Industry, briefly, I mean, it was only about a year, I think, if I'm right, Leo, that he was a minister, because right from the beginning, he not only tried to get involved with the trade union officials, and as Leo describes, there was sort of bemusement in the department, who was the Confederation of Shipbuilding and Engineering Unions, because they knew all the companies, who were in their offices all the time and to whom they were giving money, but they didn't know the trade union movement. But Ben didn't simply convene the officials. The civil servants could have just, looked up the name Confederation of Shipbuilding and Engineering Unions and made a phone call. He actually invited in the shop stewards, and that would involve a real relationship with those shop stewards, which was organized particularly through the Institute for Workers' Control, which we can discuss a bit later. But this was really what actually put the wind up the establishment, because it was really valuing extra parliamentary politics, and that was a challenge to the sovereignty of Parliament, which in effect is the sovereignty of the state through the symbolic, sovereignty of the crown. And I'll just read a very quick quote, if I may, from the civil servant who was Ben's kind of, head of department. And he said that he in particular, he paid attention to any proposal that seemed likely to infringe, this is him, Sir Anthony Part, any proposal that seemed likely to infringe the sovereignty of Parliament. So as far as possible, I tried to use as a yardstick the question, does this proposal make practical sense? And is it constitutional? Now we haven't got a written constitution. So none of this was democratic or transparent. It was the senior civil servants interpreting their role as to protect the unwritten constitution, which is the elite's control of the state. And so, I mean, Ben was already acting, I mean, he was constrained. I mean, in a way, this is the contrast between him and Jeremy Corbyn. He was in a shadow cabinet that was, not cabinet shadow, but an actual cabinet that was dominated by the right. You know, Harold Wilson very quickly took over the writing of the industrial strategy, marginalized Ben, and then sacked Ben. So in one sense, he wasn't a threat, but you got a glimpse of why he was seen as a threat, because of this opening to extra parliamentary pressure and to building the expectations of particularly workers in manufacturing. I mean, I don't want to generalize too much, because, you know, I was very influenced by this experience on Tyneside, where he absolutely did raise the expectations of those workers. Similarly in Coventry, in any manufacturing area. So, I mean, I think, you know, he would say that he was a reformist who meant it, and being a reformist that meant it meant that he exerted and tried to mobilize every possible kind of power, but he came up against not simply the British state, Sir Anthony Part and so on, but a Labour Party that protected the British state. And I think at some point we need to discuss the fact that actually, and again I can quote, you know, the Labour Party is actually often as more conservative than the Tory party. There's a very good quote from Peregrine Worsthorne, who was a Tory journalist in the, I think in the 80s. And he said, he was contemplating the sort of battle inside the party. And he said, much of the stability of this country depended on the Labour Party, which in some ways was just as powerful a force for continuity and tradition as the Tory party. And this is partly because it's a party that rests on the organised working class, but yet it contains the organised working class. It sort of provides a kind of protection of the parliamentary state against the working class, so that there are moments when the working class kind of breaks through. Its militancy in the workplace is reflected in a struggle within the party, and the 70s was one of them, that then begins to break through. And that's why the whole issue of reselection, you know, reselection seems very kind of moderate. I mean, but actually it was like when it began to happen, just all hell was broken loose. I mean, it was like seen as a threat to everything, you know, the Queen, NATO, you know, it was like a threat to the state effectively. And so, you know, it's like, you know, the movement has stood on the balls of the state, you know, and the state is screaming, and, you know, this is because it's challenging that parliamentary domination. Anyway, I could go on, but I won't.
Great, Hilary. I'd love to see the movement to deselect the Queen. Anyway, so before we go over to Leo, we're just going to bring in a question which is related. So in your response, you can link it into kind of what's been said before, but also this question from John Merrick, which is that the statist left and more libertarian left have consistently reflected attention in socialist thought and practice. It was started to be discussed last session, so in those talks that we had about democratizing nationalization models and developing other models of common and social ownership, but politics was always regarded as a priority over economy. Do you think divorce of politics and economics has been damaging to the quest to create socialism?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I don't know where to begin. You were going to ask me a question about Lucas, so I prepared notes on that, but that kind of illustrates it. So, I mean, in a way, that separation is like a protection of the market. It's like a protection of both the market, you know, because economics is seen as as apolitical as sort of in the sphere of the market, and politics is handed over to the Labour Party, i.e. to Parliament. So it meant that there was always a sort of reluctance of the trade unions or trade union activists to, or not just a reluctance, it was more like a culture imbued by the leadership and the structures of the unions, not to be engaged in politics themselves. That wasn't to say they weren't involved in the Labour Party, but they were like delegating issues of politics, issues of industrial strategy, issues of the welfare state to the Labour Party. Now that, in a way, the condition for that was the Keynesian sort of settlement, that in a way, the Keynesian settlement sort of protected the that separation of politics and economics, because it enabled trade unions to make gains through bargaining and through the redistribution of surplus through the bargaining wage relationship. But when that broke down, and also when you got globalization and the impact of international competition, so you had closures, you had introduction of new technology, rationalizations, restructuring, then in a way the existing forms of trade union bargaining, concentrating only on wages and conditions, were inadequate. And that's what led so many shop stewards committees. I mean, Lucas is the one that's well known, but there were many shop stewards committees who, firstly, they would occupy their factory, saying, actually, we're not redundant, you know, our skills, our capacity are needed. And so they would occupy the factory, but that wasn't really sufficient of a bargaining position, because these companies were multi-plant, multinational, and they could just move the assets elsewhere. That's what they were going to do anyway. And so they began to think about alternative strategies. So in the case of the Lucas plan, which maybe you'll ask me about more in detail, but they decided, well, okay, we got to put forward our own plan. You know, we've got to defend production. And a bit like the slightly different from the UCS people, didn't just occupy, that they had what was called a work-in. They carried on working. And so they were already challenging that division between politics and economics. And I think that, you know, in a way, that's what Ben did. He broke that taboo. You know, he brought together economics and politics in the way that he developed an industrial strategy that presumed a highly political trade union movement. But I mean, because I'm enthusiastic about this experience, I might seem to exaggerate it. It was mainly the manufacturing sector. And although later on, Ben's campaign, the alternative economic strategy, was also about fighting the cuts, because you've got to remember 1976, the most massive cuts in public spending ever. So I remember on Tyneside, there was not only the organizing around the industrial strategy, but that then was combined with public sector workers fighting against the cuts. And all this produced a very political labor movement in a place like Tyneside that was kind of in spite of the Labour Party. You know, the local council was run by fairly reactionary, well, I won't say reactionary, but right of centre Labour Party people. So this was a movement outside, but with some links in, and that led, you know, people to think of new forms of organisation. We created a thing called the Socialist Centre, which was sort of people inside and outside the Labour Party coming together, creating a bookshop and an alternative centre for political education. So there was all this experimentation, which was about a different kind. It was a kind of searching for socialism, but searching for strategy, socialist strategy that was not, you know, insurrectionary, so not revolutionary in that sense, but wasn't within the framework of reforming, ameliorating the existing state or existing capitalism. So it was a very, you know, rich period, but I should stop, I think.
Leo, why don't we give you a crack at this whole web of questions that we've now sort of sprouted, and give you 5 minutes to answer all of that and give us a satisfactory answer as well, please.
You'd better wave to me with your fingers as I start approaching 5 minutes. Where does one begin? I think crucial here to this whole discussion is, especially to pick up Max Shanley's point about Ben's speech at the 79 party conference on we have to live up to the challenge of the reformer, which is to be committed to changing the system and yet knowing that we have to change it for the people that we are responsible to while they continue to be dependent on this system. And it's important to recognize that he said that in the context of responding for the National Executive Committee to a militant resolution calling for the immediate nationalization of the top 250 companies in Britain. This was a constant resolution that Militant put forward. And Ben was telling people to vote against it. And essentially, he was articulating a view that he held very, very strongly, which is that there really are no serious revolutionaries in Britain, to pick up Hilary's point about the so-called 1968 revolution, that nobody really believed that you could in one go smash the existing state and introduce socialism. That everybody was in one way or another putting forward a strategy for getting into parliament and developing then the capacity and the orientation to winning popular support for a set of radical democratizing and socialist measures. Now, I say all this, I begin with all this because there is, I think, it's important to recognize that in 1970, the majority of people who were insubordinate in the 1968 sense of the word would not have been caught dead in the Labour Party. They went off to form better Leninist parties, including Hillary, if I may say so, for a period of time. And that's what led her to write with Sheila Rowbotham and Lynn Siegel that incredibly brilliant book on the limitations of the far left, Beyond the Fragments, the organizational and ideological limitations of them. And so this was a matter all along for the Labor New Left of picking up the energy, the popular orientation, the democratizing orientation, yes, the participantist orientation of the 1960s generation, but bringing it into the party to change it. I myself took the view that that was an impossible thing to happen. I admired it enormously, was convinced it would fail. And to some extent, unfortunately, I was proved right, and perhaps proved right again in the most current context. But it was a very admirable attempt because it was sober rather than naively insurrectionary as to how change could come about. Now, what was also especially significant about Ben, about the New Left generally, that went into the party as opposed to the old left, was while they had to work very closely with radical trade unionists, whether they were socialists as general secretaries or the shop stewards Hillary is speaking of. They were not oriented to what the old left was, what the Communist Party leadership was, which was above all to give priority to a common front against a reactionary Tory government. And that's what drove Michael Foot. He was the link and buckle with the left-wing union leaders, but the main thing he wanted was to ensure that they did not split with the right of the Labour Party, with the Roy Jenkins and Healyites, etc. And his main orientation, however much he supported a shift to the left in policy terms, was to try to keep that link between the right in the party and the left in the party as a top priority. It was a popular front strategy, if you like, for those of you who know the 1960s anti-fascist orientation. Whereas Ben and the New Left that came into the party as they realized the Leninist strategy and just the general campaign strategy wasn't changing the world, was to push a confrontation around the need to democratize the party in order to get the socialist policies through. And what was remarkable about Ben was that by 1971, he was going to trade union conferences. The TUC itself, the engineering union, which was then run by a former communist who was very traduced even by the old labor left. Barbara Castle once said to Hugh Scanlon, leader of the engineering union, when he was opposing wage restraint, "Get your tanks off my lawn, Huey." And she was, of course, implying that he was a Stalinist supporter of the invasion of Czechoslovakia. So that old Cold War stuff was operating, but Ben went to those conferences and said, look, you left-wing unions will vote for radical resolutions at conference, but do you expend any effort trying to educate your membership in this stuff? Are you trying to make your members into socialists? Are you trying to get them beyond the goal of higher acquisitiveness, as he put it, by getting higher wages? So he was challenging the unions themselves, and sometimes even going as far for them to be called, for them to turn towards being more democratic themselves, which the labor left has always been afraid to do. This was very, very important. And I think it has to be said that the radical shop stewards that Hilary was so close to and has done so much to show what they were about in terms of industrial democracy and the transformation of industry into producing socially useful things. They themselves did not represent the attitudes of the vast majority of their trade union comrades. And they weren't very good about turning them into socialists either. And so what was going on there was not only a need to democratize the party, but a need to democratize the whole labor movement. And insofar as it didn't succeed either then or now, that has a lot to do with that failure. I'm sure my 5 minutes are up.
We have about 20 minutes left, so we're thinking of sort of switching tracks now, moving the discussion up to the present, thinking about the experiences of the New Left, everything we talked about so far and what they have to offer sort of in terms of lessons for, you know, in some ways the very different world we're in today, in some ways some of the same problems we're facing. I'll start off with maybe a short question just to carry on off of what Leo was saying about the labor movement, you know, in the 70s and Ben's sort of relationship with it. We've had a bunch of questions in the chat just about sort of the rejuvenation of unions. Hilary, you've mentioned the Lucas Plan a couple of times, so maybe you could talk a bit more about maybe not as much that experience itself, but sort of the what its legacy is and what lessons we can learn for today from that experience, and you know what still resonates, what maybe doesn't as much, and just generally, you know, about the relationship between unions and the Labour Party today, when we are seeing maybe a bit less in the UK than say in the US, but some reemergence of sort of labor activism from below. We've had a question too about the radicalization of political bloc workers in the 70s fighting for unionization, and we see some more campaigns for unionization itself, and especially around the coronavirus pandemic, that question has really risen to the fore with this, you know, key workers, essential workers, all of that. So maybe just another 5 minutes on unions and the Labour Party today and all those lessons.
Okay, I mean, I'll talk briefly because actually there are other people here. I can see Jane Shallis, who can talk a lot about the teachers, which is obviously very crucial. And there'll be other people here, maybe from the newer unions, the international workers, so on. So I'll just say one thing about or maybe two things about the Lucas Aerospace experience. I mean, its legacy now seems to be mostly, and rightly, to do with technology and alternative products, and the idea that you know, now the issue is conversion of a high carbon economy to a low carbon economy, or at least that's crucial. And in a way, the lesson from Lucas is that key to that is actually production itself and technology. And the one of the key points about the Lucas Plan was actually in a way, it was an influence from 68, where the critique of technology and science had been a product really of the whole experience of the Vietnam War and the use of napalm and chemical warfare, and that led to a radicalization of scientists and designers like Mike Cooley, who began to see technology as political, not only in its use but also its design. So they, when faced with redundancies and the white hot heat of technology imposed from government and management, said, well, hang on a minute, we're the people that design that technology, and we know that there are alternative uses to that, as well as alternative designs as to how it's used and how it's developed, and the role of labor, of people, of workers in the labor process. So I think now, in thinking about the move away from our present high carbon forms of production, any Green New Deal has got to have a very radical critique of the existing power relationships and forms of ownership of industry, and has got to be closely allied with the trade union movement, the base of the trade union movement, and that requires its democratization. I mean, another feature of the Lucas Plan was that it was the product of what was called a Combine Committee, which meant it brought together all the unions in the workplace, the skilled union, the AUW TAS. I mean, now a lot of these are involved in Unite, but it brought together all these unions, and then it brought together the representatives from all the different sites, 13 different factories across the country. But yet, for its efficacy, for its power, it depended on each of those site organizations, those factory organizations. So when it had its meetings, the representatives couldn't just take a decision and say, okay, we'll decide to do an alternative plan, and then we instruct our members. No, it had every shop steward, and I would sit in on these meetings, had to talk about what they thought their members would accept. So there was a kind of real sensitivity to the views of the members. The members would discuss the agenda of the Combine Committee before the meeting. So this meant that when it came to the alternative plan and the idea of asking the members what the alternatives they had, there was already a culture of believing and needing and being accountable to the knowledge and capacity of intelligence of the members. So democracy was built into, and a participatory sort of consciousness-raising democracy was built into their culture. And so that, in a way, points to the idea that any radical trade unionism now has to be really deeply democratic. And so democratization isn't just some kind of add-on, extra. It is actually fundamental to a radical trade unionism. And I think the other thing is the reaching out, the connecting to the community, and so not accepting the boundaries of the workplace. And I think many of these things have got lessons for how the new trade unionism develops its kinds of democracy. And finally, a concern with the content, the purpose of production, which again, from talking to Jane Shallis, is a feature of the teachers' union. They're not just concerned with wages and conditions, they're concerned with the purpose and content of education. So I think democratization of the unions is absolutely key, and that maybe that's something that, in a sense, was a problem for the Corbyn movement, that actually that process of democratization in the unions had not taken place. There wasn't a process of transformation in unions like Unite. And so I think that is a crucial, new sphere of, if not struggle, but political consciousness raising, organizational consciousness raising. I mean, in a way, learning from experiences that TWT's methods of organization are really exemplary. Your ability to organize very open, very sort of genuinely participatory forms, is something that the unions could learn from. And so somehow infecting the unions with that kind of culture would be a remarkable achievement, because that's a condition of industrial power. You can't. I think there was a quote from an early shop steward movement, early shop steward in the early 20th century, saying, you can't have solidarity between sheep, i.e., solidarity is between, intelligent people, and that needs to be built, and that capacity needs to be organized as a sort of collective sharing and developing of knowledge and capacity. But I think bringing others that know more about other modern, contemporary developments in the unions, or I'd say to them, please come in.
We'll give Leo a crack.
Well, I think it's very important and a very I think salutary thing that in the current conjuncture, there seems to be a great deal of sympathy and support amongst industrial workers for the campaigns and demands of public sector workers. And I think that precedes the pandemic. It's a response to the recognition, I think, on the part of all workers of the way in which austerity in the public sector has impacted negatively on their own lives, and a recognition of how hard done by those who have provided the essential services that the public sector provides to meet basic needs have been taken away. This is very, very different from what happened by the late 1970s, when there was this last movement to transform the Labour Party into a party of socialist advance. The winter of discontent was a moment of public sector radicalism, which industrial workers were largely alienated from and critical of. And the shift that took place to support the reaction of the Kinnokites, who had been part of the Tribunite left, against the Labour New Left, the alliance between Foote and Healy against the Labour New Left, which got the support of the industrial unions, it reflected that alienation, if you like, between the public sector campaigns and the manufacturing unions. And in the current situation, I think things are very different. And that makes me very hopeful. I think it's a very important difference between why the campaign could continue now more successfully than then. What makes me less hopeful is the reaction of even Unite, let alone the GMB, to Corbyn's commitment to do away with Trident. This was never adopted under Corbyn's leadership by the Labour Party. And the reason it wasn't adopted was that the unions that represented workers there didn't want it. And insofar as they didn't want it, it was because they didn't have an orientation to the type of conversion of industry that Hilary is talking about. And there wasn't much pressure, as there had been from the Institute of Workers' Control, which some of the union leadership was, of course, supportive of and financed and was close to in the 1970s. Now we see today in the context of this pandemic how essential it is and how people will respond positively to a campaign to turn production of unnecessary, harmful, whether to the environment or to peace, manufacturing production to the production of goods that are needed for meeting basic needs. And here in Canada, not far from Toronto, the largest General Motors plant was closed last year. And a Green Worker Alliance emerged that called for that plant to be taken over, to be brought into public ownership, and turned into the production of environmentally useful goods. They didn't have the foresight to see that it should have been turned into the production of ventilators, as well as what is now being used for the production of masks which only involves bringing 50 workers back. But the importance of this couldn't be clearer in the context of this pandemic. This was on the agenda in the 1970s already, as Hilary reminds us more than anyone. And it needs to become much more on the agenda today than it has been, and that the unions, even the left-wing unions, have allowed it to be. Does that help?
That's really helpful. Thank you. That was really, really interesting. And for those of you who can see the chat, there's also been a really good complementary discussion going on in the chat. So do try to read over that as well. So we're just going to try and wrap it up now, I think, with a question just to close it, which is to ask a little bit about the legacy of the New Left project. And I think this has got really important lessons for thinking about the current moment for the left and the Labour Party for us as well. So one of the problems that Leo and Colin identify in the book is that while the project did successfully train and develop new activists and bring them into the state, they didn't manage to consolidate their ideas into any enduring institutional form. Can you tell us, so can you talk about what, like, your main analysis of why you think that is, and what lessons we can draw from that today? We can start with Hilary.
Oh. Well, I think that in some ways it wasn't lack of interest, it was lack of opportunity. In some ways, the movement to achieve reselection actually was quite an institutional movement. It tried to institutionalize the democratic aspirations of the of the movement around Tony Benn and the movement around policy. So in a way, there was, although the emphasis often was about policy, increasingly people were concerned with institutions and with accountability and with democracy. And certainly you could say that many of the moves in local government, like the move to the left in the GLC, was quite an institutional move. I mean, in some ways, many people were beginning to find the limits to purely movement politics. And I mean, even within those movements, there was a lot of debate about lasting institutional forms. So in the women's movement, for example, we have this whole debate about the tyranny of structurelessness. Now, in a way, that realization and recognition of the tyranny of lack of structure, lack of institutional form, that was a sign that people were beginning to take questions of institutions and structure seriously. I mean, we didn't come up with answers, but I think there was an interest, and these shop stewards combine committees, they developed their own constitutions. They were quite institutionally sophisticated. The question was the state was relating to state institutions and attempting to change state institutions. And that, in a way, the experience of Tony Benn was that he both came up against the limits of the party, but also the limits of the state. And in a way, that was a real impasse. There wasn't, the balance of power wasn't favorable enough to take that any further. But at a local level, in a way, we did experiment with pushing that. So at a local level, without going into too much detail, in London, which was in a way more than local, I mean, it was had a budget and size equivalent to many countries, we did engage with the view that we couldn't just talk about policies. We had a very detailed manifesto that the Labour left had drawn up, but we were appointed, a lot of us who weren't in the Labour Party, and we weren't asked to be in the Labour Party. We weren't, saying, they weren't saying to us, Ken Livingstone wasn't saying, like, where's your party card? We just were there because we had experience of, participatory democracy or working with shop stewards. I mean, there were several shop stewards themselves, like from Ford's, who actually worked in our popular planning unit. But we had, right from the beginning, an approach that we can't implement policy without changing the state. And actually that led to a very creative collaboration with Leo and people in Ontario who were beginning to try a similarly left government. It didn't get very far because it wasn't really a left political leadership, but that led to this conference that Leo organized on a different kind of state. So in a way, we, right from that moment, we developed an idea that, you know, this was a time when privatization was beginning to get underway. So we would say, no, you know, we're against privatization, but we're not defending the existing state. We're saying that democratization is an alternative to privatization. There was this very famous book now called In and Against the State, which was saying, yes, we need to defend the distribution of resources so that public money, this taxation that leads to public resources and public spending and public services, but they need to be administered in a more democratic way. So that led to, later on, to struggles against privatization, which were also about struggles to reform the state. So I think a lot of those ideas have their roots in the 70s, which you could say was both an era, a decade of movements, of strong movements, both in the public sector and in manufacturing. But it was also a moment, a decade in which people began to take institutions seriously. I don't know, Leo now, what Leo thinks.
No, I agree with that. I think the question was, you know, what legacy did the attempt to change the party and that new left inside the party leave? And, you know, most obviously, it left the Socialist Campaign Group inside the party. That group of MPs that had broken with the Tribune group of MPs at the time that Foote aligned with Healy to defeat the Labour New Left. And that came to a head around Foote's election as leader and Ben sidelining for running as leader, and then Healy's very, very narrow defeat of Ben in the deputy leadership campaign with Foote's support. So a small group of MPs then formed the Socialist Campaign Group. And, you know, people like me, and I think Hilary, but certainly me, you know, admired them, including Jeremy and John once he was elected, John McDonnell once he was elected, but thought they were spent force. And then lo and behold, they rise from the ashes like a phoenix to nominate Jeremy. And even that I thought was as far as they could ever get. And then draw in hundreds of thousands of young people to get him elected. Who would have believed it? So the legacy, most astonishingly, was that this incredibly marginalized group in the Labour Party, which of course had a lot to do with the fact that Britain, like Canada and the United States, has a first past the post electoral system. Had there been a PR system, it's not unlikely that those MPs would have gone into some realignment of the kind that happened with Euro-communists and Trotskyists and Maoists and left social democrats in those countries in Europe where there's proportional representation. And then Jeremy never would have been leader of the Labour Party. But that was a legacy. The legacy that was not left there with them was this radicalism that Hilary's been getting at in the labor movement. The defeats suffered by trade unionism were massive in the 1980s. And you know, those defeats were delivered at the hands of the Thatcherites and Reaganites, but they were also delivered often at the hands of mainstream European social democrats, not very distinguishable from Blair's New Labour. And in the wake of that, the kind of energy that the Institute for Workers' Control, et cetera, had provided in the labor movement for the types of things we're talking about were not sustained, partly because they weren't funded as much. What was also going on, one has to say, is while Hilary and I, being the stubborn people we are, kept on with this, most intellectuals who were enthused by this in the 1970s turned away from class politics, turned away from the need to democratize the institutions towards a, I think, rather superficial identity politics, which labeled every identity a movement, and saw the future lying in that, even though they at the same time rejected any notion of a grand narrative move towards socialism. In other words, there was a treason of the intellectuals in these decades. And that's important as well. Some of that took place, as people in Britain know very well, within the Communist Party, and that produced the kind of Marxism today ideology briefly. So that too was not a legacy that was continued. But I do think that both with what Jeremy and John and the campaign group managed to hold on to, and I'd immodestly say what Hilary and I and Colin and people like us and people on this, so many who I recognize on this Zoom connection kept on with, that was the legacy that then linked this all to a new generation, which even after Jeremy's defeat, or the team of Jeremy's defeat, if you like, I think we'll carry this forward in a very creative way in the 21st century.
Yeah. Can I add one thing? Okay, so I think the other legacy is a kind of a confidence in an alternative left, an alternative socialism. I mean, Leo's book is called Searching for Socialism, and I mean, obviously, we do need to keep searching, keep experimenting, because it's not found. It never will be found. It's got to be made, and that process of making it is going to be a long one. But I think that Ben, his caricature was never accurate. I mean, I remember in the similarly with the GLC, Norman Tebbit at one point in a speech in the US said, "This is modern socialism and we must kill it." I.e., the idea of a socialism that was open, that was democratic, that couldn't be labeled as sort of Soviet command economy, all this, was a threat. I mean, in a way, Ben wasn't as sort of widely, popular at certain points as Jeremy was, but I think that Jeremy also was able, in 2017, to convey that idea of a kind of humane socialism, a democratic socialism, and we've got to hold on to that idea of combining the transformative power from below with a democratic state supporting that liberating, emancipatory power within society that's a capacity of all of us, but needs support. So needs the support of the state at different kinds of levels. So continuing that process of experimentation, including from the experiences of this pandemic and all the forms of solidarity that have been produced, and developing a vision which could be practiced in the Labour Party, but I think a lot of us will probably feel the emphasis now must be on building that capacity from below, and then attempting to fashion the Labour Party to support it, but maintaining our autonomy in society, in the movements outside the Labour Party. And in a way, I feel this is what TWT has achieved and what any kind of reformed momentum could achieve.
I think that's a really good note to finish it on. Thank you so much. That was an incredible discussion. Really, really interesting. I learned so much. I think I'm going to have to watch it again to really learn everything that was being said. But just to say again, I'd really, really recommend both Leo and Colin and Hilary's books on these topics. Leo and Colin, Searching for Socialism, and Hilary Wainwright, A New Politics from the Left, where these arguments are made really strongly, and they bring in fantastic anecdotes. They really just take you back into that moment. So do check out those books if you're interested in reading more. So we're nearly at the end of the call. we just wanted to remind you of a couple of things. So TWT are trying to organize as many online spaces for people to interact as possible. TWT have created a step-by-step guide for supporting people to run political education and organizing meetings online. So we'll post a link in the chat now. Keep an eye out for reading groups and all these other kinds of political education, organizing meetings, and of course, tune in to the call the same time in 2 weeks.
And I will make one more plug. Finally, if you are able to join, please do join the TWT Supporters Network. As we said, it helps us put on events like this one, a conference later on this year, and all sorts of other political education, which is more important than ever today. And this crisis really does pose an existential risk to a lot of things, but also to small organizations like ours. I think that link will also be in the chat. It's theworldtransformed.org/support. We will be back in 2 weeks with Leo again, and his guest John Trickett. I don't know if they'll be playing dueling bookcases in the background as well, like we had today. They'll be talking about New Labour and the wilderness for the left in the 90s and 2000s. And that's it. We'll see you then. Thanks everyone for tuning in. See you 2 Thursdays from now, and good night.
And thanks everybody from me.
Night.